to understand the roots of the problem, we have to go beyond the last 50 or 100 years or whatever. We need to go back much further in time. So, let me give you a brief account of the history of this region. For that, let's go to the map. Finally, I can show the map again. Here we are, map. So, this is India. I'm sure you are all familiar with this part of the world. Now, let's go westwards. Do you know where Ukraine is? Well, here is Ukraine. This is Russia. If you can see my mouse pointer, this is Russia and this is Ukraine here. So, what's the history of this place and why did this conflict occur? So, that's what we want to understand. So, let's go back in time. Let's go back about 2000 years. So, the Ukrainians, Russians, all these people are the Slavic peoples. They belong to the Slavic ethnicity. So, the first recorded reference in history of the Slavic people is in the 1st or 2nd century AD. It's the Romans who had recorded some Slavic ethnic group or tribe or something in Eastern Europe. So they have always lived in Eastern Europe, the Slavic peoples, right? And about so present day Russia, present day Ukraine, Belarus, etc., has been traditionally the homeland of the Slavic peoples. The Russians are the largest ethnic group among the Slavs. The Ukrainians are also Slavs, the Serbians, etc. They are all Slavs, Belarus, and so on and so forth. So, about 1,000 years before today, in the 9th century or so, the Vikings, they made their way into the Slavic world. There was this leader called, I think his name was Rurik, who came and he took over the leadership of this place, of the Slavic people. So the Slavs were a polytheistic people. Their chief god was Perun, or what we call Parjanya in Sanskrit. He was a rain god, thunder god. You could see him like Indra, for instance. The Vikings also had, the Scandinavians also had very similar culture, so they were able to intermingle nicely. So these guys, under this guy called Rurik, they became the leaders of the Slavs for some time, even though they were Vikings. So the Slavs had Viking leadership, and these Vikings, they called themselves Rus. So it is this Viking term Rus that eventually got attached to the Slavic peoples, and they started calling themselves the Kievan Rus. Their leader was Rurik, and then it was Prince Oleg, and so on and so forth. Their capital was Kiev. Okay, so Kiev was the capital of the Kievan Rus. They were the Rus, not the Ukrainians. So that is the first capital they had, the Slavic people, in their first in the 9th and 10th century, and in the 11th century they became Christianized eventually, and so on. And this region, which is now called Ukraine, was eventually called Novorossiya. Novorossiya means southern Russia, or rather New Russia. So it was mostly uninhabited for the longest time, and then eventually you had various kinds of peoples who made their way into this place, right? For instance, the Scythian people, the Alans, the Bulgars, the Mongols, the Tatars, and eventually the Russians also made their way into this place, into Novorossiya. In the 14th century, this place was called Little Russia. In the 17th and 18th century, the Russians, the Serbs, the Greeks, etc., they moved into this place, and that's when this place got the name Novorossiya. Later, it was called Ukraina, which means the borderlands of Russia. So, as you can see, it's always been Russian territory. Now, how did the nation of Ukraine come into being? The modern nation state of Ukraine come into being? So, for that you have to go back about 100 years. So, after the 1917 revolution in Russia, when the Bolsheviks came to power, the region that they controlled, the USSR, was created, and it was divided into various administrative zones, or Soviet Socialist Republics, SSRs. And one of these republics, for administrative purposes, was called Ukraine. So it is this region that we see here, right? So that region was created for administrative purposes, and some territories were added to it, which are all Russian speaking, and so on. And in 1954, I believe it was Nikita Khrushchev, after the Great War, after the Second World War, he added the region called Crimea, this peninsula over here. He added this region for administrative purposes to Ukraine. Now, the constitution of the USSR was such that all these various republics had the right to secede from the union. But under people like Stalin and Khrushchev, etc., the control was so strong that nobody would even dare to think of seceding from Russia, from the USSR. Right now, so all these regions were made part of Ukraine for administrative purposes. The eastern parts of Ukraine, the Luhansk, Donetsk regions, which is known as the Donbas region, is Russian speaking. And strangely, the Ukrainians, okay, I'll come to that later. So what happened is that after the dissolution of the USSR in 1989, Ukraine and various other republics declared their independence because Russia had very poor leadership, very weak leadership at the time. So in the 1970s and 1980s, the economy of the USSR was not doing well because their leadership was not strong enough. And in the 1980s, it was Mikhail Gorbachev who came to power. He is, you could say, the weakest of all the leaders in the USSR. He is the one the West loves the most and the Russians hate the most, because he presided over the destruction of this country, the USSR. So Ukraine became independent in 89 or 91. Look it up which year it was. I don't remember all the exact dates. Ukraine and various other republics, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, and so on and so forth, they all became independent. Moldova, Belarus, Lithuania, Latvia, and so on, they all became independent. They all declared their independence, and the Russian leadership was not strong enough to keep them together. So they were allowed to become independent. And in the case of Ukraine, there were lots of these Soviet nuclear missiles and warheads on Ukrainian territory. So what the deal that was cut for the Ukraine was that you give up all the Soviet nuclear weapons. In exchange for that, we will cancel all the debt that you may have to repay, because at that time the USSR owed a lot of debt to various countries. So the Russian Republic said that we will take care of all the debt. You don't have to pay it, Ukraine. Just give us back all the nuclear weapons. So that was the deal, and the Ukrainians gave away the nuclear weapons to the Russians, and the Russians ensured that the Ukrainians, they would not have to pay repay any of the debt. And they also subsidized the development of Ukraine. In the last 20 years, more than 100 billion or 150 billion dollars worth of subsidy has been given by Russia to Ukraine. So you had people like Viktor Yanukovych, who was the president of Ukraine. Listen, I know there are very smart people who are watching and who will watch in the future, who will say, you did not mention so and so leader, you did not mention so and so president. I am giving a very brief, condensed overview of history. This is not a history lesson. This is about geopolitics. I'm not going to mention every irrelevant politician who ever came to power in Ukraine. So in November 2013, Viktor Yanukovych was the president of Ukraine. Then there was this revolution in Ukraine, the 2014 Maidan revolution, the Euromaidan revolution. So in February, I think 2014, the elected president of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych, was ousted. He was thrown out, and somebody else was put in place, Petro Poroshenko, I think. All right. So this was essentially a pro-EU, pro-NATO, pro-US government that was installed in the place of the legally elected government of Ukraine. Okay, these are facts. I am not putting any kind of spin on this. These are just hard facts. So a pro-NATO regime was installed. This is essentially nothing but a coup that the West engineered in Ukraine. Currently, as of today, I am not mentioning all the politicians who came to power. If you want a list of politicians, you want a dry history lesson, look it up yourself. Currently, the president is Volodymyr Zelensky. Right? He's a former actor, former comedian, whatever. Right? So he is in power right now. So let's go back to 2014 again. Once this coup happened, so now I can tell you this, that strangely enough, the Ukrainians in the past 20 years have not conducted any census. Because if they were to conduct a census, what you will find is that there is a very significant Russian-speaking population across Ukraine, mostly concentrated in the east and south, but in other parts of Ukraine also. Right? So the Ukrainian language is a Slavic language. You could call it in some sense a dialect of Russian in some sense. I know lots of people will say, no, you are wrong, you're pro-Russian, blah blah blah. You can leave if you think that way. So Ukrainian is it's very similar to Russian. The so essentially it's the same people. It's not a separate ethnicity, separate race, separate culture. It's the same culture, same people, everything is the same. Their ancestors were the same, that sort of thing. So the Ukrainians are not willing to show how many Russian speaking people live there. uh, so in 2014, after this illegal coup that was engineered by the West, a pro-Russian unrest started in Ukraine, starting from I think February 2014. In March 2014, Mr. Putin annexed Crimea. You see this peninsula over here, that is Crimea. It's always been Russian. It was added to Ukraine for administrative purposes by Nikita Khrushchev, and then after Ukraine's independence, it became part of Ukraine, which was Russian territory. So Mr. Putin annexed this in March, I think 2014, and then you had the war in Donbass, in the Luhansk and Donetsk regions, and so on. In May 2014, there was a referendum, okay, in this region. Uh, so this referendum, I think what happened is in April 2014, two independent republics were announced in the Donetsk region, the Luhansk People's Republic and the Donetsk People's Republic. In May 2014, referendums were held, the Donbass status referendums, which sought to legitimize the establishment of these republics. And the war continued, the unrest continued. In 2014, there was this terrible tragedy, this horrific tragedy. Malaysia Airlines Flight 17 was shot down. They thought it was a civilian aircraft or whatever, a military aircraft or whatever. It was a horrific disaster. Then in September, you had the first Minsk agreement, which was a 10-12 point peace plan that was agreed upon. So that was in September 2014, the first Minsk agreement. In November 2014, there were general elections in the Donbas region, which elected the chief executives of these two republics and the parliaments of these two republics. By January 2015, the Minsk Protocol had collapsed. So in February 2015, the second Minsk agreement, Minsk 2, was agreed upon, which was, I think, a 13-point agreement, in which there are a couple of terms, I think point 12 or 13, or 2, 3 of these, that both the sides interpret very differently. So again, the Minsk 2 agreement protocol has never been adhered to properly. And this fighting continues. The separatist sentiment continues among the Russian speaking people. In 2021, there was a significant escalation of fighting. By the end of 2021, there was a significant Russian build up in the regions that are adjacent to the Donbas region of Ukraine and various other places. And also, interestingly, in 2014, I think it is in December, Belarus changed its constitution, and which effectively ended the neutral status of Belarus. Belarus is this little country here. It's also a Slavic country. It was also a part of the USSR. So Belarus amended the constitution, which essentially makes it nothing but a satellite state at best of the Russians. So you can say that Belarus is now willing to host Russian nuclear weapons and Russian nuclear missiles. And it will be the Russians who control it. So essentially, Belarus is, you can say now, annexed by Russia. So Belarus can be considered Russian territory from now on. So in 2021, there was this Russian buildup, end of 21, around Ukraine. Significant escalation of fighting. 2022, it continued. The escalation continued further. And the last 48 hours, we know what happened. Mr. Putin has ordered an invasion of Ukraine. Now we don't know how far the invasion will go. Whether it will be whether Mr. Putin will be content to liberate the Donbas region, the eastern regions of Ukraine, the Russian-speaking, Russian majority regions of Ukraine, or does he want a complete regime change and removal of Mr. Volodymyr? Um does he want to remove the current president of Ukraine? So that is what we need to see. That is what we are going to see in the coming days. Whether Mr. Volodymyr Zelensky will remain in power, I mean, not in power, but in his office, or whether he will be removed and some other person will be put in place. So if that happens, it is a complete regime change. Otherwise, if the Russian incursions are stopped at a certain point, then it is a liberation of certain territories. And it's also interesting to note that some of the Russian incursions into Ukraine, invasion essentially, have happened from the north via Belarus. That's interesting. So essentially, Belarus is now part of Russia. And we are also seeing now that the Chechen troops of the Russians are now being readied. They are being prepared to come and occupy parts of Ukraine. The Chechen troops are the ones who are in the Caucasus, this region, right? This is Chechnya. There was a horrific civil war there. It was eventually controlled by Mr. Putin. It has come under control. The region is pacified. It is stabilized now. And the Chechen troops of the Russian army are the most battle hardened troops. They know how to deal with everything, including insurgencies, including street fighting, including guerrilla warfare. They can deal with everything. They are the ones who will be put into place into Ukraine. So they will be able to deal with any insurgency that may happen in Ukraine, because obviously the West is not happy with what's happening. The Americans are not happy. The NATO is not happy with what's happening. Uh, and they may try to foment insurgency and all after the Russian takeover of the place. So that is where we are, and that is what I can tell you about the history of this place.